Are you scared of stretch? Are you having nightmares about knit? Are you jaded by jersey? And that's why I can't go on Sewing Bee. Well, fear not. I am here to demystify stretch fabric and get you sewing like a boss. I was that person too. Terrified. Little did I know, once you speak the language, there is a whole world of amazing stretch fabrics out there. A whole new world. What I realised when I finally gave in to stretch fabrics was that actually it eliminates a lot of the tricky issues that we find when we work with wovens. Who here can really say that they enjoy zips and buttonholes? None of that with jersey. And when it comes to fit, because our clothes are stretchy, we've got a lot less of the nitpicky fitting issues that we might run into with a woven. And yet we'll need to do the classic adjustments like narrow shoulders, longer or shorter torso, but the really intricate stuff we don't need to worry about. It's gone. I also find I get a lot more wear out of my jersey projects than I do out of my woven projects, partly because I'm lazy and I can't bear ironing, but also just because they're so comfy. A lot of the time the best patterns come on jersey too, because they're often intended for kids. And let's face it, I'm just a giant toddler, so what's not to love? The first step towards being a wizard with stretch fabric is to get your cutting right. This can really make or break a project. If your pattern pieces are stretched before you even start, you're not going to get a good fit. I would tend to avoid using your pins when it comes to cutting your stretch fabric, because these are likely to snag and pull your fabric, pulling your pieces out of place. I tend to just weigh my pattern pieces down with any heavy objects that come to hand. I would also say avoid using scissors for cutting your stretch fabric. Far better to invest in a rotary cutter, but do be careful because they are really sharp. One of the most common misconceptions when it comes to stretch fabric is that you need some kind of fancy machine or an overlocker to do a decent job, and that is simply not true. Pretty much any sewing machine will have a selection of stitches which are suitable for stretch fabric. The problem with sewing stretch fabric is that because your fabric is stretchy, if your stitch is not stretchy, as soon as you stretch that fabric, it will pop. When I started sewing with stretch, I didn't have any of the extra machines. I just had my basic machine. It wasn't this one, it was a brother, and it did a perfectly good job with my stretch fabrics. This top that I'm wearing right now was made on that old machine, and the insides aren't perfect, but it does the job. It's been washed and worn loads of times and it's still standing the test of time. A lot of domestic sewing machines will have what's called a lightning stitch, which is specifically designed for stretch fabrics. It looks a little bit like this. But even if your machine doesn't have that feature, you can still just use your traditional zigzag. Just make sure you set it nice and narrow, something a bit like this. Some machines will even have a kind of faux overlocker stitch. So as you're stitching your seam, it will also make a sort of bound edge. Obviously it won't trim like an overlocker will, but you can just come along afterwards and trim with some scissors or a rotary cutter and get a really nice edge. You don't even have to finish your seams on the inside if you don't want to. You can just leave them raw. It's not going to fray. It might roll up a little bit, but who's going to see that? One thing to bear in mind though, with particularly the lightning stitch, it does eat up a hell of a lot of thread. So I would always buy 2 of whatever thread it is you're using for your project. Otherwise you run the risk of some thread roulette. One thing that you absolutely must have if you're using a traditional machine is some stretch needles. They usually say either stretch or ballpoint. They're both pretty much the same. And without these, you will probably find that your fabric will be torn to shreds. These have a little ball end on them, so rather than piercing your fabric, they push the threads aside. So there's no ripping, there's no snagging, and it'll go through the machine nice and smoothly. So here we have the mysterious overlocker. So many of us are scared of these, and I can kind of see why. They do look like an instrument of torture. They do carry an element of danger, and you do need a degree in schematics to thread one. However, we can work around that. The most important thing to remember is that overlockers can smell fear. You just need to approach them with a level of confidence. You are not the boss of me! The advantage of an overlocker is that it gives a really nice professional finish, and it can be quite a time-saving device as well. So it's actually sewing your seam at the same time as binding the edges and finishing the inside. One very vital thing to remember with an overlocker is that once you have sewn a seam, there is pretty much no going back. Your seam allowance is trimmed, there are a lot of threads, So to unpick and unravel and start again is incredibly difficult. Check, check, check again, and be very sure about what you're doing. This is my second overlocker. My first one I busted, more on that in a second. This is the Jaguar 489. I'm not endorsed by Jaguar, they just had a good deal on when I was looking for a new machine. And the thing I really like about this one is that the entire thing opens out, so you've got a really clear view of what you're doing when you're trying to thread it. There's none of that like pokey round corners in the dark kind of business to contend with. Of course, the instruction manual covers threading, and most machines will come with these little coloured diagrams to help you as well. However, I still really struggle with that. This is where YouTube will become your best friend, because for most models of machine, you'll find that some helpful person has made a video of how to thread it. Thankfully though, there are a few hacks to make your life a bit easier when it comes to changing the threads on your overlocker. My personal favourite is to just never change them. I like to keep a set of grey cones on mine. I find because it's such a neutral colour, I can get away with doing most things with those. So it's very, very rare that I ever change my overlocker threads. I don't know what I'm going to do when these bad boys run out. Hack number 2, you could try just changing one of your cones. The only one which is going to show onto your fabric is usually this one on the left side that goes to your left needle. The other 3 will show on the inside of your garment, binding the seam. However, this is the only one which you will actually see in that seam line, so you can get away with just changing one. The final thing you can try if you need to rethread your machine is to snip all of your threads, pop your new combs on, tie the new thread to the old thread, turn all of your dials down to 0, and then very gently pull them through the machine until they come all the way through. Then give them another snip, thread your needles, and away you go. I mentioned that I broke my old machine. What I did was I got a pin too close to the blade. So because what this is doing as you're sewing is it is chopping your fabric as you go, if you bring a pin too close to that chopping action, you're going to break a blade and potentially throw your whole machine out of whack. I bought a new blade, I replaced it, it all looked absolutely fine, but the balance was off, the tension was off, it was just never the same again. So my top tip to avoid that problem is winder clips. You can't miss these, you can't forget about them, you can't get them too close to the machine. These work a treat to keep you and your machine safe, because you also don't want a blade or a pin pinging in your eye. So the other thing that domestic machines can do quite well is twin needling. So this is the effect that you might want to use around something like a neckband to keep everything nice and flat and well finished. So you end up with 2 lines of stitching with a zigzag on the reverse, so it still stretches really nicely and doesn't pop open. Personally though, I have wasted hours of my life trying to set up twin needles on domestic sewing machines. It's so hard and very often it's just not worth it. So I eventually invested in a cover stitch machine. I say invested, but my mum bought it for me, which does the job really, really well. However, there's nothing to say you can't just use, again, your narrow zigzag, nice and stretchy, nice and neat. No one's going to notice the difference. So where can you start? A few awesome projects to get you going. Number 1, the Mandy Boat Tee from Tessuti Fabrics. Super easy, free to download, and a total wardrobe staple. It's been updated now to come in 4 sizes rather than the old one size fits all. You'll want to choose a nice drapey jersey for this one. And I like to vary my hemline, so sometimes I'll scoop up at the front, sometimes I'll scoop down at the back for a bit of bum coverage. You can do short sleeves, you can do long sleeves, you can do 3/4 length sleeves. The world's your oyster, and this looks good on everybody. Project number 2 is the Seamwork Astoria. This is a short sweater, looks really good over a dress, but also with jeans or a skirt. I tend to add just a little bit of extra length in the body to mine, but that's just personal choice. It is really quick to put together. There's very little you can do wrong with one of these. It's great for learning a few of the important techniques. It also takes very little fabric, so again, a nice stash buster of a pattern. Project number 3 is the Jennifer Lauren gable top. This is a very classic style, think Audrey Hepburn, very nice slash neck, really sophisticated. It's got good length in the body, so it's great for tucking in, and it also has a dress expansion pack, so you can turn it into something flouncy. I've actually hacked my gable pattern and I've added on the Mandy Boat Tee neckline. Again, it's just personal choice. I just like to see a little bit of collarbone. So there you go. Once you speak the language of stretch, it is easy, it's quick, it's so wearable, and there's a massive array of fabrics out there that you're missing out on if you don't give it a try. If you do still feel a little bit apprehensive about working with stretch, get yourself a copy of the Bible. This is the Tilly and the Buttons stretch book. It's an awesome troubleshooting resource. It holds your hand through the whole process. Any problem you encounter, you'll find the answer to it in here. It's also got a plethora of patterns and projects for you to get started on.